Okay. Aquini, Isaiah, Sleeping Turtle. I was adding people to the video, and somehow it seems that when I add them first, you're not able to see it, but it is public, so other people can see the video. So I'm going to briefly tag some people in the video so that we can get more. Um, let's see. Let's see if I can somehow. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like it's okay. Oh well, we can just start. Facebook does not seem to be working the best today. Um, Akwani, we are here to discuss the term Indian, the word Indian, where it comes from, how it's been used, and what are the consequences and implications of this term in the indigenous world of the Western Hemisphere, and how we can relate to one another, uh, being aware of the implications, those implications. So I'm joined by Sleeping Turtle. He is Narragansett and Cherokee tribal person, and I am Behike Hefzibah. I am of the Taino Arawak Nation of Quisqueya at the River Haina. That is within the country now known as Dominican Republic. I am here in Massachusetts territory, in the northeast of what is called the United States. And Sleeping Turtle, you can tell us a little bit about where you are and what sparked your interest in this topic.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'll turn up my volume so I can hear you better.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay, thank you. So, before we start analyzing today's topic, uh, once again, I am a sleeping turtle of the Narragansett and the Eastern Band Cherokee, and where I have been living for most of my lifetime is the area known as Quidnick Island. Previously, during the early colonial period, this island was known as Pocasset. Uh, and coincidentally enough, we have the Pocasset Nation, who is neighboring Aquidneck Island and Tiverton, Westport, and Little Compton, still in the state of Rhode Island. And for those of you who don't know, Aquidneck Island used to be Rhode Island, and the surrounding territories were Providence plantations. And one quick piece of information, the first colonial governor of Rhode Island was Benedict Arnold's grandfather prior to the American Revolution.
Okay. Um, so um, you were the one who suggested that we discuss the term Indian. Um, Personally, the term Indian is something that we didn't really uh, talk about in my family. Growing up, I, um, just the ways of how northern tribal people want to be called was something that, as indigenous people, we usually leave up to others, to hear how they want to be discussed. So if we heard that um, a tribe was meeting at such and such a place and they were being called American Indians, then we came to kind of accept that um, that's a general term that uh, they preferred. You know, we didn't really get into what was better, or should they be called Native Americans or should they be called American Indians. We already had experience of how we were misnamed in Quisqueya, and uh, we were told that we are Arawak peoples. So I didn't grow up saying to myself, I am an Indian. I grew up saying I am Arawak, I'm Quisqueyan. So there was already a bit of separation there between identities of northern tribes and Caribbean peoples. So that's why I reserved my opinions until I heard from others like yourself. And of course, there was a debate going on when the National Museum of the American Indian was going to be built. Should it be called National Museum of the Native American or National Museum of the American Indian? And I saw that debate in the newspapers. I think it was in the early 2000s, and they said that basically that Native American had certain legal implications, that kind of like other terms, they were curated at a later date, whereas the term American Indian had a more an older reference, I guess, something to that effect. It was less, maybe less politicized, if you will, or so it seemed. So I'm interested to hear why do you feel this is important?
I feel that not only the debate, but also the analysis of those terms are important because it helps clarify the various groups of indigenous people who inhabit North and South America. Now, growing up, before I was aware of my indigenous heritage, I was thoroughly confused by the double meaning of the ethnic term Indian. Now, in school, I remember hearing stories about Gandhi and colonial India when England had colonized the Indian subcontinent. Whereas when we would be studying in school colonial American history, I don't recall any of my teachers using the term Indian or American Indian, and I was too young to really articulate the questions I wanted to ask. Where later I developed more of a sophisticated vocabulary. However, growing up, especially here on Aquidneck Island, where the history of indigenous people is often hidden or not talked about, it was confusing that if I would go out into the community and start talking about Indian culture, people would think that I'm referring to the Cherokee or the Pokanoket or the Passamaquoddy, and I would have to
Mm,
clarify that I'm talking about, the Rajputs or the Mughals or Shah Jahan,
mm,
people who helped develop what is now known as India as a dignifying sovereign country today.
mm-hmm,
And by the time I became involved in the local indigenous community, there is still that perplexing confusion. And luckily, I have some material examples here to help uh, clarify when I speak of India or Indian people.
mm,
Now, I used to have rather personal debates with a local indigenous organization here on Aquidneck Island because the chairman and I were not butting heads, but when I would provide to him information about India, and the different ethnic groups of that territory, he would become defensive that no, that's a different type of Indian. We're the American Indians. And then my
Mm.
rebuttal to that would be, well, what do you call an immigrant from India who moves to the United States?
They would be like Indian American.
Exactly. But that still doesn't solve the confusion with the colonial community, because here in the United States, especially, there's been this perplexing confusion about that one term because it's applied to various groups of people that are not, you know, that are not interrelated in terms of culture, bloodline, history, or nationality.
Right. I remember being asked many times, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" And uh, in the 80s and 90s, pretty much nobody talked about Dominican Republic at all. So if I would say my family's from Dominican Republic, they were like, "Where's that? What is that?" So I remember my father saying, "We're from the West Indies," because um, that was a term that had an academic reference. Indies and Indian, when it refers to Western Hemisphere indigenous peoples, it's related. So people could at least say, well, okay, not East Indian, but West Indian. But even so, that left me very perplexed. And I do remember having a conversation about why we say that we're from the West Indies. And my father explained that it had to do with the storyline, the narrative that Columbus got lost and thought he was in India. So that was very upsetting to me, that we should be defined by somebody's uh, story who is genocidal, and I just, it just feels, even to this day, the term West Indies feels very uncomfortable for me, even in academic terms. Um, but uh, besides just, the inconvenience of having to say Indian American versus American Indian, um, there are there's undercurrent of certain projection of behaviors where uh, people are being asked to erase the ethnic and national um, inheritance of the people that are being talked about. So rather than referring to actual tribal nations, they just say a general term that comes from uh, the, uh, the lore of people who were not part of that nation. Um, and you were talking to me about this even when it has to do with East Indians, because India today, it was a much well, it used to be a much larger territory of federations of many ethnic nations, and now they're broken up between Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, uh, and there was a great division. I think they said there was the largest migration in human history during the division of India proper, after the exit of the British, when they sowed division between the peoples. Before, everybody was intermarrying and everybody still knew their nationality. They're speaking so many different, hundreds of different languages. And then when the country was broken up, they all had to go their separate ways. They were no longer um, permitted to be together in this inter-ethnic, diverse but very self-aware group of people. And so when those uh, um, groups were shuttered, in India, those that were majority not Muslim, for example, the ones in India, that it was like a more of a religious division rather than national, or ethnic division. So those who associated with the Hinduish and the more ancient religions, I'll just say, religious beliefs, they stayed in India, and so the British, they started calling them Indians, just everybody. Didn't matter if what ethnic background they were, and of course there were many refugees that went to Britain and to the United States after that those tragic events and genocides, which heroes of the Western Asian populations like Winston Churchill, they were celebrated. Uh, the same people that were carrying out the genocide in India, they had to the Indians that emigrated, they had to accept them as some kind of people on a pedestal. So it was all about shuttering down self-expression, uh, being having self-determination, and so just having this in mind while a person, let's say from one of those indigenous Indian ethnicities, are coming to Britain or coming to the United States, they no longer can name themselves because nobody cares, and they're just Indian American, or uh, Indian British, or British Indians. I guess they would be called British Indians, which is interesting because when we talk about Britain and all of the indigenous people that were kidnapped from the Americas, they also went to Britain. They were taken to Britain. And there's still descendants over there that are aware of their heritage. And so they would be called British Indians as well. There would be no distinction as in America, where you have Indian American versus American Indian. Um, you mentioned this person by a yoga instructor that came to Chicago in the late 1800s. Why is that important?
Well, I feel it's important, especially at that time period where most United States people were groomed to believing that the people known as Indians are Apaches or Lakotas or Cherokees, the indigenous people to the United States,
Mm,
specifically lower 48. However, the yogi that I mentioned to you, yogi is someone who does yoga. Uh,
mm-hmm,
the title he was given is Swami Vivekananda, and pardon me if my pronunciation is not too accurate. However, by reading about him and what his contributions were to the rest of the world, it was mostly for him bringing a lot of this ancient knowledge from India, because he himself was born in Calcutta, and bringing it
mm,
to the United Kingdom and also the United States. Now, Vivekananda, during the late 1800s, spoke at this. um, it was an event held for the different world religions that the city of
mm-hmm,
Chicago hosted. Swami Vivekananda came to represent Hinduism and that religion's contributions to not only the rest of the Asian continent, but also to the Westerners who came there at various time periods. Now, when I wrote about him specifically on another indigenous network, I made a distinction that he himself is Indian, being from India, but also the confusion that he must have experienced in his time where he's coming from India, whereas the Americans are then um, confused because when they think of an Indian, they would think of Sitting Bull or Red Cloud or Goyatla. So even that, has to be clarified that this was an international event, for the spreading and the acknowledgement of different religions. And the Americans, you know, weren't really too sure how to address him properly because, again, the confusion around the term Indian. Now, coincidentally, when he went there, it was after a trip he made to the UK to help spread yoga to the West. Now, as I'm looking at my notes here about him specifically, he was also a major force in different Hindu reform movements in India. He contributed to the idea of Indian nationalism and independence from British colonial forces. He also started the Ramakrishna Mission and Ramakrishna Math, and I could go on and on. And the particular event that I referenced is known as the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, Illinois, taking place in the year 1893.
Oh,
So that would be
1893.
that would be 3 years after the Wounded Knee massacre. Uh, to put
Wow.
that, yeah. But that's my point, is that all of that information is readily available to the entire world, and for some reason a lot of people in the United States and to a certain extent Canada are thoroughly confused when presented with this stuff because it reveals to them that their um, lifelong teaching that the indigenous North American people are quote unquote Indians, it it's shocking to them. And I've had to explain this even to my students and other educators who work with them, that this confusion is easily demystifying once you have names and references to bring up. And
Hmm. And yeah, I had some very unpleasant experiences lately on social media. Um, I won't name the platform right now, but it, I was interacting with Western tribal people uh, from the Midwest, and they were very possessive of the term Indian, and that was really interesting for me because after I learned what Indian was supposed to mean in the United States, it was applying to all indigenous peoples, regardless of what nationality they were from. Um, then I just thought that perhaps it would be the same, that they would know that it's okay for, let's say, South American Indians to be called such, indigenous. Uh, Other North Americans, such as Mexican Indians, especially with the exiles that happened. It's really surprising how possessive they were. And they literally said to me, you can't call yourself American Indian unless you are within the United States borders, unless your original tribal territories are within the United States borders. And I was I was telling them, well, the Taino Arawak, we had settlements in what is now southern Florida, and they didn't even know that. They were like, you can't call yourself Indian, American Indian, because your tribal territories weren't here. And I had to tell them, in the fact, the Taino, we are the first ones to be called Indian. Of all the tribes in the Western Hemisphere, we were the ones first to be called Indian. And they didn't know that. It seems like they thought the term just kind of was birthed in the history of the United States, which it wasn't. It was birthed in the history of the Caribbean peoples, um, and there's to this day there's very different attitudes of that term in South America than there is in North America. Um, and I wanted to, we had a very lively discussion the other day, and I wanted to kind of show people how, even between you and I, there was like misunderstanding or, confusion about this. Because you did not know how much rejection there was to the term Indian in South America. So it's like, as indigenous people, when we move into the borders of what is now the United States, it's like we try to assimilate to the culture, right? We try to orient ourselves according to the parameters that are offered, right? So it's like, if there's a national museum of the American Indian, we're thinking that's a good thing. It's like a national museum of the African American, right? It's like we would not think, as indigenous people coming from outside the United States, that Indian is a term that is used to belittle or patronize. You know what I'm saying? So even though for us in the South it's offensive, when we're in the United States, we're saying, well, yeah, we are American Indian. See, but then we are told, well, you don't get to use that term because this is only for us. It's not for you. And it's like, wow, this is so strange, because we were the first ones, to be called that. And so, and you were mentioning Canada as well, how the term is Indian is used in Canada. It's so different. Canada, United States, Caribbean, Mexico, South America, Central America. From a positive perspective, this is where the disagreement or the misunderstanding happened between you and I the other day, because you were thinking that the term Indian, because you've been living here for a long time, you're thinking the term Indian is something that we would all want to be associated with. But I was saying, well, we can't talk in those terms, because if we have an audience of South American indigenous peoples, they would be extremely offended by it. I mean, it's a really bad epithet. It's like the N-word in the countries of South America. And there's no way for anyone to just suppose that there's acceptance or general use. Even the division between the elders and the youth, and how we are adapting to these things, this is a very real thing. It's not that we're just trying to entertain an archaic issue or problem. So regarding this treatment that as indigenous people we have to go through, and we're these barriers that we misunderstanding between each other because of a single term, can you talk about the top-down patronizing and reductionist policy of colonial entities in the United States and Canada that are behind the denotation of the term Indian?
Well, yes, and for the viewers who don't know, quickly, denotation would be the literal definition of a word. Connotation would be figurative, like slang, for example. Moving on. So, pardon me, did you say the denotative or the connotative?
Well, I actually didn't mention either, but I was talking about the policy that is behind the use of such terms. The how it is top down, patronizing, reductionist. That's the attitude behind foreign general terms of indigenous peoples. And you're mentioning the connotation and denotation. You're saying that we have to break down the word usage in these two areas. So can you explain that?
Well, yes, referring to the top down, usually between the president, Congress, and uh, for a long
Parliament.
time now, yep, Parliament and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, is that those terms have multiple meanings in every area of the United States and also Canada. Now, what you were
When you say
mentioning earlier,
areas, when you mention areas, what areas are you referring to? Can you give us some examples?
well, for the United States, here in the Northeast, specifically New England, the Midwest, like for example, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Uh, to be frank, I don't recall any area in the United States where a lot of people aren't taught that indigenous Americans of the United States are not called Indians. I don't think I've ever encountered that in my travels. And what really gets me going passionately about demystifying and correcting that confusion is that when you were talking about how some people in the Midwest, they hold on to that term American Indian as if it's like a birthright somehow, and they overlook all of the negative applications historically of that term when in use. Now, to get to the root of those problems, people have to know history, they have to know where the word comes from and at what different time periods did it mean and what was its context for its use, which we won't go into all of that today. Now, what happens here in the United States, especially for about the last 120 years, is that the term Indian has been used legally to not only classify different groups as being more quote unquote worthy than others, but the government uses that term to sow a lot of division. Now, one
Mhm.
thing I noticed when we spoke about in our last episode, the paper Genocide, on how a lot of Nahagantans would legally identify as uh, African or some other term like that, is that if they identify themselves as a quote unquote Indian, they could be killed at that time, like without persecution. And the
So
part that
Indian
gets me is,
was, well, you're saying
go ahead.
Indian, okay, so Indian is being used now, but at one point, Indian was meaning any person claiming indigenous identity and subject to being killed for self-identifying. So the
Yes,
people took different terms, but now okay, so this is like on the East Coast. I think you're saying on the East Coast it had a very bad term, but on in the Midwest it was used as, because they were so they met the colonizers later and they were so defensive of their territories, then Indian meant basically like rebel, a rebel.
yes.
So it has a
Now,
more prideful connotation, you're saying.
well, yes, and for before we go any further, we have to remember not all indigenous people during colonization spoke English or French or any
Mm,
European language. So for them to be presented with a term that does not exist in any of their languages, they weren't quite sure what they meant from the colonizer point of view. Now, again,
mm,
no, learning language, linguistics, and etymology is important, but at that time, a lot of that information was not available if you weren't assimilated into colonial society, which is why I brought up Swami Vivekananda, late 1800s, representing India, and and the confusion continues about that one term. Now, one thing to
Mm-hmm.
keep in mind is that yes, different areas of the United States did have different social meanings behind that one term. However, a great amount of legislation meant to curb the rights of indigenous people. That term Indian is used as a verbal and legislative weapon because of its dense legal meaning. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember speaking about this with two members of the local Pokanoket Nation on how uh, they said to me that legally American Indian would make sense in a courtroom, whereas they would also say to me that they're indigenous. And I asked them, "Can you elaborate on that?" Well, they would use the term American Indian, like to the Supreme Court, for example, knowing all of the different treaties that are signed by people agreeing to be called Indian, whereas they know
Mm-hmm.
after all of this development in the modern world that they're not Indians, but they use that
Mm-hmm.
term to invoke the different treaties and legislation that was signed by some of their ancestors and the federal government.
Mm. Okay.
That's part of the problem, is that there's a
Mm.
denotative, connotative, social meaning, and then there's a legal one on top of that. But a lot of those aren't clarified to the general population. It's the same
Mm.
problem that African Americans have when they mention that they're black, Negro, or colored in court, and they're unaware of the Christian black codes that are designed to keep them, under wraps, because if you agree to be called that, then you're only limiting your rights, meaning that you're
Mm.
non-descendable by calling yourself a color and not an ethnicity or a nationality.
Mm. Yeah, as far as the denotation in the South, where, my people have been called Indios, which when it was brought into the English language, they turned it to Indian, um, based on the morphology of the English language. But in Spanish, they had their own um, syntax, where in Spanish, when they talk about people in a dismissive way, or uh, in a disparaging way, it is very unusual for a person to just be outright called what they are, because in the cultures of West Asia, that's seen as projection. So if a person was to call another person a bad name, then that's seen as them reflecting on themselves. It's kind of like, well, if they stepped in it, what do they say? If the glove fits, or something like that, it would be, have that
If the
kind of
shoe
terminology.
fits, wear it.
Right, if the shoe fits, wear it, exactly. So in Spanish, even to this day, like the national day, the yearly event of April Fools in the United States, they say April Fools because English does not have that roundabout way. They don't, it doesn't express itself, or it's not as careful. It's more direct, because it's Germanic. But in the Romance languages of Southern Europe, because I believe it has to do with the occupation of the Moors for 800 years, they adopted Moorish behaviors. And so in the Sahel region and you know, East Africa, Arabia, using bad words is really um, is seen as a self-diagnosis. So people would say, as I was mentioning, in April Fools, they would say Day of the Innocents. Innocent meaning um, those who are not self-aware. See, uh, it has a very direct term, meaning that the person is an idiot, an idiot. It doesn't mean someone who is uh, having a pure mind or is innocent like a child. You know, it if an English-speaking person were to hear someone talk about El Día de los Inocentes, then they would say, "Oh, that's such a cute, you know, day, you know, Kids' Day, you know." But no, it actually means Fool's Day, the Day of the Fools. Um, so in that way, when my family were called indios, we were being mocked as people that did not have concern for the priorities of the monarch and the organized religion. And as such, we were uncivilized. And so it's just like when they talk about someone who has um, learning disability, you know, in America, I heard people say, "Oh, so and so was touched by an angel." You know, have you heard of that? You know, like so and so is touched, right? Um, you know, touched by God, and there are certain true things about that. You know, because people who are neurodivergent are indeed have special abilities that are, you know, spiritual and ought to be revered in the sacred way, as indigenous peoples have always done. However, when it is in the colonial context, to say that somebody is touched, it can be a mockery. And so that is what they meant when they said indios, they were saying touched by God. In other words, mentally disabled. Yeah, because we did not have um, a warring culture. We did not share their behaviors, their priorities to take the uh, extract resources like they did, you know, to they thought that our lack of exploitative behaviors was a sign that we were oblivious. You understand? So they said these people are touched, you know, they're touched, and that's what indios actually means, someone who is retarded. And so that just goes to speak about how that the English who were actually um, interacting, they were traveling on the same trade winds, and they spent time on my family's territories, and they would be exchanging these communications, you know, and so by the time they set up shop on the east coast of North America, they already had an agenda to call all indigenous peoples by bad names and to project um, demeaning and pejorative attitudes onto the indigenous peoples in order to justify the genocide and land theft that was going on.
Yes, and thank you for explaining, uh, briefly about the history and the origin of that term that the conquistadors used. And information like that is immensely important and valuable for all indigenous people to know. And what's really sad about that is some of us here in the United States are complacent to accept that negative and pejorative identity from the colonials because of not only the history and the lifetimes that some of us have spent being oppressed, by those, who use that term against us. And when I would provide examples, loosely like yours or what I said earlier to my students, and it really saddens them that there's complex identity issues and debates when some of them are inherently negative. And when talking about that in detail with some indigenous people in the United States, uh, I won't lie, when presented with some of that information, some of us get emotional or upset or angry or start crying because they've accepted a lot of those falsehoods as truth despite the
Mhm.
information presented to them that would contradict what they've been taught. And I find that
Mhm.
happens not too much anymore, but back when I came across my heritage, that those of us who came later in life into um, some of the different cultures of indigenous people, uh, that confusion is there. Well, how do we identify ourselves to non-indigenous people? And what I mean by that is if somebody asked me what is my ethnic nationality, I may say Cherokee. And to them, Cherokee would be the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the automobile. And it wouldn't dawn on them, well, where does that name come from? And stuff like that, it still bothers me, to this day. But when you take the time to explain to people in ways they can understand about a lot of these commonly known names and words, it can help wake them up out of that colonial mindset and acknowledge that, something is not right here.
Mhm.
And and I feel that's worth a lot of the debate and conversations that United States indigenous people are having. I
Mhm.
mean, for example, years ago, I used to connotatively call myself either Native American or Indian, and I was working with a coworker one time who worked out on, I think, Pine Ridge for a few years as a counselor for the women.
Mhm.
And she asked me, well, she said to me, "Don't call yourself that." And I asked her,
Mhm. Mhm.
"What do you mean?" She went on to explain how even today that term is used negatively whenever people coming off of the reserved land and they go out into the colonial communities. That was when she told me about the term indigenous, and I was able to do more
Mhm.
research on it. That's when the big light bulb went off, and how I began preaching and sometimes shouting, figuratively at other people that indigenous Americans were not Indians. Because once you're
Mhm.
presented with the information that clears everything up, why would you continue accepting the incorrect fallacies? And
Yeah, and it's so important for people to know that those of us who have uh, those of us who have experience with other languages, European languages like Spanish, it's important to interact with us and hear what we have to say when the Spanish are speaking, because we have experience listening to how they use words, like I was saying, Dia de los Inocentes. It's not innocent whatsoever. And you know, even if you look in the history of that celebration, it was about mocking indigenous people for the traditional ceremonies of the change of the seasons. So there has been a constant mockery of indigenous peoples, and because Dominican Republic is in Spanish-speaking territory and much of South America is in these Romance languages regions, then we can inform English-speaking people, no, they are not saying that you are innocent. They're not saying that you are like God. They are saying that bad words to you, and we can give examples of actual things that have happened to us, even on a day-to-day basis. I mean, just pick any telenovela, from South America or Mexico, and you'll see that the indigenous person is treated like a slave, and is treated like a non-human being, so they say La India or El Indio, like as if that person does not even have a name and does not have their own identity. And that has to do with discovery doctrine of denying agency and even humanity to indigenous people. So that's why it's really important for us to understand the background and to have a dialogue of our experiences of different regions, because there are so many things that you're telling me that I was not even uh, privy to. Like I I could have suspected certain things, like what you're talking about, the treaties where people are having agreed to a certain term. I could have suspected that was the situation, but to hear it from actual source, it's so different. It's like it becomes a real thing. It's not just like a passing thought of the imagination. So once those texts were made, and then they were talked about in the general public, in the media, it gave a sense to the people that they were also supposed to share in the disrespect for indigenous self-determination, and also to disregard the multiplicity of ethnic and national self-determinations of the people. So if the people can be homogenized as just a general term, like what you were saying before about colors, then all of a sudden the land has no name, and the names of the land is also changed. Like right here we have the Quinnobequin River, which means in the Massachusetts language the winding river, or the lively river, and they turned it to the name of the English monarch Charles. And so they did that by getting people to acquiesce and believe that it was okay to practice such paper genocide and brainwash. It's a brainwashing thing. It's not just casual to come across something that already has a name and then just say that's not the name anymore. We're going to just change it. We're not going to be respectful. It's very methodical and weaponized, as you mentioned. So this is part of a global thing too, because in empire, in the militarization, I think you mentioned that wherever people go, it's okay to do that too. So if they go to Asia and they see someone, they'll just call them a brown person. If they go to Africa and see someone, it's a black person. They don't have a nationality anywhere. And this is the culture that, as people living in North America, we've come um, to assimilate to. It's like, and even to think of it as something that is beneficial to us. So then we lose. We're denying ourselves. We're self-censoring, self-censorship, and we lose agency simply because we come away from these discussions, these topics, and understanding. Um, and so it looks like we are all our own oppressors. Um, when we spoke last time, we talked about this shutting out of the meat from the meaningful participation in the development of demonyms. Can you please tell us what is a demonym, and what does it mean not to participate, and how do we know that calling ourselves American Indians isn't a participation on our part?
Well, to explain a demonym, I'll do it quickly and simply. A demonym would be the name of a citizen from a region or a nation. Like, for example, America, if you're descended from there, you are American. If you are from Spain, you are Spanish. If you're from England, you are English. It's just the name of the citizens of that territory. Now, the issues that indigenous people have, especially here in the United States, is that I don't recall too many dignitaries or representatives of the nations here in the lower 48 participating in those global movements to help dignify and give people a proper name, ethnicity, title, and nationality. And yet, at the same time, like, for example, if you go and look up Goyatla, who most people know as Geronimo, depending on what source you're looking at, they'll list his nationality as Chiricahua, who most people would know as the Apache. But they made a distinction between the colonial name and the ancestral name of his people, of the Southwest United States. And I feel that analyzing different demonyms, even across different time periods is important, because not only does the public, individually and collectively learn about their history and their bloodline, but it shows a lot of the legal loopholes and weapons that have been used to falsely categorize people and often divide them against each other. And
Mm-hmm.
and what I just said is important to be said and to hear, because it's not a simple issue when you're declaring who you are and your ancestry. Yes, you have a legal name, you may have documentation and whatnot, but who are you? What is your blood? Where are you from? Who are your ancestors? And all of that here in the United States is trampled upon by the colonials calling United States indigenous people Indian or American Indian, because you're just collecting them as one entity with a name that, because of Vivekananda, no longer is truthful. And by presenting that to other indigenous United States people, they really have to have that soul searching time to comprehend everything that they've been lied to about, but also some of those lies that they have been accepting and complicit in because they simply did not know any better.
This reminds me of a situation in psychology called cognitive dissonance, when a person um, they know that something is wrong, but they choose it anyway, just because going against it would also put them in an uncomfortable position. So the repercussion that they would receive by not going along with the general term that everybody is using, uh, it's offset by the discomfort of actually having to look at that term for what it is and having these discussions. So that's a form of insidious trauma as well, and it causes disorientation and confusion. So why are we talking about it? Why? I mean, even as we're having this conversation, like, I'm feeling very uncomfortable. I'm thinking, you know, how are other indigenous contacts going to feel about talking about this? How, I mean, I'm talking about even in the United States. In South America, like I said, we cannot stand this term at all. It's like really bad. Uh, uh, we are called those things because, and we know that the governments are actively trying to, um, you know, enforce it. It's a known, it's out there, like in Argentina and Chile, even in Peru, like these places, the word Indian is put into the government to, and people say, no, we do not want to name that you are of such and such nation because we don't allow that here. That's very explicit. um, but in the United States, it's not. So there, it leaves a lot of space for intimate um, discord, between family and friends, where the battle is at home. It's not on the street. It's in our meeting places, and so if we know that it's so harmful, why are we discussing it now? Why are we having this conversation?
Well, we're having this conversation because, one, it could persuade other people to talk about it in their circles, at their dinner table, at their gatherings, because when a community is faced with that type of problem, and for some of us, it's a couple centuries worth of problems, by talking about it, you are acknowledging that there is a problem, and by talking about it, you are, for some part, agreeing to address it to get to the root of it in order to solve it. It's like going to see a therapist or a psychiatrist when you know there's something wrong, but you need a fresh pair of eyes and ears to take a look at you and to hear what you have to say. And I find, especially here in the United States, for not only indigenous people, but also for the African population here, with their whole set of legal terms that are used negatively against them. And there have been a few people within those two groups who bring this up before local governments, federal governments, on the local news, which we'll get into another day. But by them talking about it with an audience like that, they're presenting that there is a problem that for some people have never considered, or they've outright ignored or overlooked it. Now, when I've had this
Mhm.
conversation with other younger indigenous people, I see the light bulbs go off when presented with the information. However, in my experience, I've noticed more resistance from some of the older indigenous people, especially from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And you know and even that, with some of the older activists who I've met, like they could be members of the American Indian movement, from back then, and yet,
Mm. Yeah, that that
use
that
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 term.
organization's whole name would have to change.
Yeah, well, because it's a contradiction. It's the same problem with like for example, the Black Panther Party. Well, we know panther animals are literally black, but they're using that term black with double meaning for the people who occupy the party when yet that just causes more division not only with them and other organizations, but they're still agreeing to that colonial oppression, but they're trying to change the meaning of it when historically it was always negative. That was something that
Mm.
Malcolm X, for example, would talk to people about on how, black has to be a powerful thing when you check the definition for it, and there's like 15 entries that are negative. Black market,
Mm.
black list, or black, this and that, and they all mean, negative things. Now the same thing
Mhm.
happens for, indigenous, United States people with that term Indian, because you look up Indian in a dictionary, like it will list, the country India. It could be the Indus River between India and Pakistan. It could be, another Latin entry, but then it will say a native or aboriginal of the Americas. But it
Mhm.
really doesn't make a whole lot of sense on how it lists a few different groups of people who are separated by thousands of miles under the same word. And so
So
for
it's
some
use
people,
it. No, no, you're saying that you're using this one term for many people, very generally. Um, However, at the same time, they still make um, they still make allowances for themselves in the legal system. I'm talking about the colonizers make allowances for themselves in the legal system to because that term comes from their culture to pass laws or to hold on to codes, uh, statutes, and so on and so forth that nobody even knows exist on the local level. And so while everybody's walking around thinking this is just a general term, like you were mentioning from the dictionary, in reality, legally speaking, the ramifications of these colonial ethnic designations or amalgamations, um, these reductionist designations, they vary by state and region.
yes, and to make our point about everything you just said, if anybody were to look up free white person in law, you will find that not only does the term white uh, is used for Europeans, but they also include North Africans and some Middle Eastern countries. There was one man who's
Mm.
been making, a hectic argument in court who's from Libya, and his passport and American driver's license lists him as white, and he's arguing before the court that he's black when they know that if you're descended from a North African country in the United States, you are considered white. Even if you, but yet his neighbor from the neighboring southern country, like in Congo, for example, they would be called black, but you're still a person of African descent, but they're divided between the legal codes when they come to the United States. But yet
Hmm.
they would still declare their nationality, but their legal status, like a caste system, would be a color. And yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
hmm yeah, I actually had that experience. I was in a legal situation, and they asked me for the description of a person, and I said the country that they were from, and they said, and they were a like white skinned person, and they said, I think I was trying to say that they were, like from a dark skinned country, like you were saying, like, a Central Asian, and they were saying, no, that person is white, or no, that person is Asian. I forget how, yeah. And it was like the person was obviously, opposite to what I came to understand. And I was wondering, um, why are they so particular to label that person such, when I just go by these assumptions that let's say obviously they're a white person, or in another instance they would be a black person, but no, they're not black, they're Asian, you know, or they're not black, they're white. I know that happens a lot with the Brazilians. Very dark-skinned Brazilians come to the United States and are labeled as white. That's what it says on their driver's license. And so you're saying the reason why they are able to do that is because of legal ramifications,
Yes.
both federally and locally.
Yes. Yeah,
Wow.
it's
So
you know
why do these variances exist? Why do they
the
exist?
variance,
Why is this confusion exist?
the confusion exists because it's a colonial invention that has worked, for a long time to not only sow division and confusion among different communities, but to groom the people of those communities that they're not all, one human family, but yet they will take away their heritage and just give them a legal status. And it's so
Mm-hmm.
damning of how complex the issue is in all 50 states and even some of the United States territories that are not on the mainland, because they're so creative with how to divide people up like crayons, for example, and yet they still will prohibit them from learning all of this information that we've spoken about because it pulls them out of that pit of thinking that they're colors or this and that. And the
So
same
it's a
problem.
disempowerment.
Yes.
It's a disempowerment tool, a tool of
Yeah.
disempowerment.
Yes. Uh,
Okay.
uh, thank you. I was trying to remember that word. But yes, it's meant to disempower the communities in question. Now, to be fair, this happens for Europeans too. Like, in the United States, when they began using that white label, because, Europeans, the last time I checked in Europe, they're marching and demonstrating to be citizens and not subjects, like in the UK, for example. So to an
Mm.
extent, they're divided by class, not so much by skin complexion, but by your income, your regional um location, and this and that, and it just becomes so ridiculous. Like it really is. And
Yeah, it's really very it's almost feels well, I mean, I can say I experience cognitive dissonance every single time that we talk about this thing, because I'm torn between, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I think that the answer is simply to return to our indigenous nationalities. That's really the empowering thing to do. Um, Colonial ethnic designations are an egregious violation of the human conscience. That's really what's going on. Is our conscience is the last, what do you say, the last frontier of our own self-determination, our mindset.
well, yes. Now, for example, two students that I've had for 2 years now. They're immigrants from Nigeria. So when I began talking to the entire class about these color codes and legal statuses, because they were sisters, I asked them, so and so, when you were living in Nigeria, is there such thing as, quote, black people? They both said no, overwhelmingly.
Exactly. I've had the
So
exact same experience
yeah,
with Nigerians. They
so I
say the
asked
exact
them,
same. Hmm.
so and so. I mean, I don't know too much about all the different groups, but what is your ethnic nationality? And you know what they said? Yoruba, a tribe in Nigeria,
Yeah,
a nation.
Yoruba.
So it's like,
Yes,
so the class is having
exactly.
this real life example that all this stuff does not exist where they're from. So they're like mortified that it happens over here. So,
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened with my father and his siblings when they came to United States. No one had really experienced these hallways of categorizations like this, almost very, very debasing. So,
mhm,
okay, where we are from, like the lands that we come from, when we come outside the United States, we come here, we know where we're from, we know what family we're from. Like you were saying, the Yoruba from Nigeria, that's where they're from. And when they get over here, suddenly they're told they're not from anywhere, they're
mhm,
non-descendable. Is that is
yes.
that can you
Yeah,
explain
because they,
what is it, where is the concept from, the non-descendable thing? It sounds so crazy.
well, it comes from
But
because
is
the
it real?
colonial government, the colonial government realized at some point that, wait, if people keep coming here from around the world, we can't come up with all these different terms, as even we'll get confused. We have to come up with general terms for the different, continents and nations just to make our lives easier to colonize these people. So, for example, those
Mm.
two students I had are Yoruba. Well, if I had a student from Eastern South Africa and I asked them, "Are you Zulu?" and they would probably say yes. I'm surprised you know about them. And I would ask them, "How familiar are you with King Shaka?" And they go, "All right, now we can talk," because Shaka was a hero
Hmm.
to
Right,
them who not
exactly.
only unified
Exactly.
the Zulu peoples, but his bloodline was so
Hmm.
defiant against the British and the Portuguese. So it's like once you
Hmm.
start bonding with people over their ethnic
Yes.
history, that's how you start
Hmm.
healing. But it's
Yes.
sad that
Yeah.
in the United States, some of us is more taught those international social skills to build bridges. And
Hmm.
oh, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the term non-descendable? Because you mentioned that before. I never even heard of that before.
Well, to put it in simple terms, because every court in the United States, from the local court all the way up to the Supreme Court and Congress, they know that
Hmm.
human beings have ethnicities and nationalities. If you know like where you're from and who you are in your blood, then you can be traced as far back as the records can go. So non-descendable would be a term that you're agreeing to be called, which is not an ethnicity or nationality or has any history behind it. That's the problem in the United States with Africans agreeing to be called and calling each other black people, because not only is black a colonial word, it can't be traced genetically to any country or nation in the entire world. Like there is no
No claim.
national.
No claim.
Yeah, there's no claim. So your blood and your ancestry can't be traced through a visual color, which is not a person. So in every
Hmm.
court
So
in
is
where,
non-descendable a term?
yeah, non-descendable is a term that they would use in court if somebody's agreeing to be called black, white, brown, red, or yellow, because it implies that you don't know
Hmm.
your ancestry or your heritage. Those are all just American terms, like for them to not only deter your rights, like internationally and civilly, but if you don't know what non-descendable means or are aware of its applications in court, then you're most likely going to lose your case or get a really bad sentence.
Mm.
Now, just to put it in perspective, without the long rabbit trail, I think it was in 1964 when Malik, Malcolm X, made the Hajj to Mecca. A French Muslim told him that when you come to this part of the world, there's no such thing as black, white, or any of those people of color. So, as Malcolm was talking with this French Muslim, he returned sometime later and not only embraced the civil rights movement, but his mentor, Elijah Muhammad, the secret was out because the Nation of Islam was grooming a lot of their constituents and leaders that they're black, Negro, or colored. So Malcolm was going to go public and say that this is all colonial trickery to keep us in the dark. And it's suspicious that before Malcolm could do that, before a rally he was doing, he was assassinated by people from the Nation of Islam working with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. So if
That's
Malcolm
interesting.
so if Malcolm went public, that would have flipped the entire civil rights movement upside down. That all those color terms, that's for politicians and colonizers. But the problem was that
And that's what
Malcolm,
I've seen.
yeah, but Malcolm would have
That's
done that if Elijah Muhammad wasn't in bed with the enemy, keeping that black thing going because he could collect finances by being a nonprofit status that President Lyndon B. Johnson set up with the 501c3. So
I
it's
was
hush
just going to
money at that
mention
point.
that. Oh my goodness.
So when you start connecting this stuff, you see why they killed Malcolm X, Dr. King, and Fred Hampton, because they were gonna tell. Because if the African Americans accepted that they're not black people, would have been even worse for the colonizers.
That's interesting that it was just coming to mind as you were speaking about that the nonprofit corporations that are now in the newspapers calling themselves tribes, I saw this Boston Globe article. The woman is talking about making art and listening to frogs. There's no talk about food security, medicine security, land rights, land origins, genealogy. There's none of those discussions. It becomes a curiosity, a pastime, and the meaning of the word tribe is completely lost because there's no claim. There are no concrete claims. It's like a fun club, and so that would make sense that there is an ongoing campaign to encourage the non-descendable label or non-descendable association with indigenous peoples, and the term Indian is somewhat of a gateway drug, if you will, to that path, where down the road it's okay to just generalize and not be specific and not have claims to families and land, not having a genealogical link between those two, non-descendable, because in the colonizer way, that's where they can manipulate the minds, the claims, the legal ramifications, all of those things together.
Yes, and like I said, I mean, like it's so complex because now we not only are the indigenous themed social clubs trying to make their case that they're a nation, but without any history behind it, they're just saying that their group is non-descendable, even though they're all intertribal and mixed, because you're not a bloodline of people. You're not, interconnected families. It's But again, it's
Hmm.
like that
It,
non-profit
it
status
becomes it
is,
becomes a psychological association rather than a physical one. It's like it's
genetic.
open to
Yes.
interpretation. Yes, it's not genetic. It's I mean, people say, well, we think that we're related, but we don't, there's no proof, there's no testimony, even word of mouth, which indigenous
Mhm.
nations, we've kept history word of mouth for many thousands of years. There's not all of a sudden the word of mouth is not even important anymore,
Yeah.
with
Well,
the non-descendable nonprofits.
yeah. And a lot of those problems like enter the different cultures of indigenous people here, in the United States. Now, for example, I have a piece of my regalia that has, as far as I know, of two different names. So this is a indigenous war club, primarily found in Canada and the United States. Now, in Canada, this club would be known more in the Plains territory as Notina Mystique, but then the colonizers call it a gunstock war club because it looks like a rifle when you hold it like this.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
not that that's incriminating offense, but even the terms we use for items in our ceremonies, like they're done in colonial languages when we still lose the connection to the ancestors by not using the traditional names of those people, places, things, or ideas. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
watching an interview with uh, I think he was a mixture of Cree and Métis, George Lepine, pardon me, from Canada. And when he teaches
Mm-hmm.
Okajata, in Ontario, he tries to encourage his students to use the indigenous words for things, even when they're doing their warm ups and they're striking
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot. Like count in this language, or identify the weapon, in this dialect, because the more that they learn, if those students are of indigenous descent, when they're praying, they can talk to their ancestors in a language they can understand. It's not that there's
Mm-hmm.
no blood relation, but it's a language barrier, like with people now and people 300-400 years ago.
So our descendableness is also a language which our ancestors can understand.
Yes, absolutely. But that's why I brought up in our last video that, if I'm being an older form of tradition, I would be saying that I'm Aniunguia, where in the 1800s it was Salagi, and then after that it's Cherokee. But I can't talk to the eldest of my ancestors by calling them Cherokee or Salagi. Like, no, it's Aniunguia.
Mm,
Like it
mm,
helps
mm.
build that bond with not only those who have crossed to the other side, but it's decolonizing yourself with the language you use.
Yes, yes, it is indeed purifying. It's getting chilly out here in Massachusetts. Do you have any other closing statements? I could keep this conversation going on, because it's really helping. It's purifying and healing. I do feel healed by these words that we're sharing, and I I know that going forward we can um, be empowered by embracing the values of our ancestors.
Well, my closing statements would be, for those of you who commonly call yourselves Indian or American Indian, or to a lesser degree Native or Native American, I encourage you to practice saying that you're indigenous, or at least what is your ethnic nationality. Nahagangsit, Pokanoket, Cherokee, Haudenosaunee. Just get that into your common speaking, because the more that you do it, the longer you will remember it and will be able to present that information to those who need it.
Yes, and on that note, also, in the tradition of our ancestors, we call ourselves by our nationality, and also the by the typographical designations of our peoples. So, knowing their genealogical relationship to the land and using the traditional name of the land and the tradition of your ancestors along with your nationality so that people associate your lands with you. And with that, we say good night, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. And we hope that you join us again for another round of discussions with the Eastern nations of North America. Hahom, thank you. Any greeting or song you'd like to share in your language, Sleeping Turtle?
Well, commonly the Cherokee would say wadu, which would be thank you. However, I came across one source where you would say awadu. It would be like the difference between thanks and thank you. Does that make sense?
Mm,
So,
yes,
yeah,
uh-huh.
to everyone who has been watching, awadu, and peace be with you.
Likewise.